Journalists under fire in Gaza, covering Israel's ground offensive and caught up in a media war. The dangers of telling all sides of the story. This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. More than 600 killed and over 4,000 injured. The casualties from the Israeli-Gaza conflict continue to rise. And journalists are also coming under increased pressure, reporting on a highly sensitive, divisive and polarised situation. War zones, by their very nature, are extremely dangerous. But safeguards do, or at least should, exist to protect both civilians and journalists. UN Security Council Resolution 1738 urges national governments and all other parties to an armed conflict to do their utmost to prevent violations of international humanitarian law against civilians, including journalists, media professionals and associated personnel. Well, one journalist has been killed covering this current conflict. A cameraman with a production company died when a tank shell exploded near him. And on Tuesday, Al Jazeera's bureau in the Gaza Strip was shot at and hit by two .50 caliber bullets. Staff were forced to evacuate the 11-story building. Al Jazeera has submitted a letter of protest to the Israeli Prime Minister. Al Jazeera correspondent Stephanie Decker took pictures of the bullets and the shattered window. This is how she reported that incident.
Well, there were two very precise shots fired into our office. We're on the 11th floor of a residential building. It does have some offices, including the Associated Press, which is opposite us on that 11th floor, the top floor of this building. We were sitting around and all of a sudden a shot came through the live position. This is a terrace area, and straight through the windows into an area. It's like a sitting area and a kitchen, and everyone was very surprised, and we were trying to figure out what it was. We thought perhaps a warning shot or maybe an electrical explosion, and then very soon after a second shot came in. So certainly the message then, we did receive it quite clearly and we all evacuated.
Well, that happened the day after Israel's Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman said that he wants to ban Al Jazeera from reporting inside Israel. Part of what Lieberman sees as a problem is Al Jazeera's links to the government of Qatar, which he accuses of funding Hamas. According to local media, Lieberman said that Al Jazeera has abandoned even the perception of being a reliable news organisation and broadcasts from Gaza and to the world anti-Israel incitement, lies and encouragement to the terrorists. Well, Al Jazeera has sent a letter of complaint to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying this unjustifiable attack on Al Jazeera's offices is in clear contravention of international law, which provides unequivocal protection to journalists in areas of armed conflict. Of particular concern to Al Jazeera is that this attack on its office directly follows Foreign Minister Lieberman's inflammatory and grossly inaccurate statement. Lieberman's statement, made during a period of such intense conflict and violence, can only be described as an incitement to commit acts of violence against Al Jazeera. Now, reliable information can depend on who, what, or which side you're listening to, and this conflict, of course, is no different. Gaza is strictly off-limits to Israeli journalists. The government decides what information comes out of Gaza and is reported to the public. The Israeli government has also told foreign journalists in Gaza that it can't be held responsible for their safety. And in breach of international law, foreign journalists must register with the government press office and sign a waiver declaring that they won't file a lawsuit for damage, injury or death. So that's the backdrop for this discussion. Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. We're joined from Paris today by Soazig Dollet, head of the Middle East and North Africa desk at Reporters Without Borders. From Gaza, we're joined by Rami Almeghari, a Gaza-based correspondent for Electronic Intifada. And from Tel Aviv, Ben Hartman, who's the national security correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Soazig, we'll start with you. Under international law, let's just clarify this. Under international law, what obligations does the Israeli military have to ensure the safety of journalists working in its field of operations?
First of all, the UN Security Council from 2006 to 1738 mentioned clearly that media professionals should be protected and are protected and should not be targeted by parts of the conflict, and that should be from the Hamas and also from the Israeli army this time. And regarding the obligation from the Israeli army, you got, according to the international human rights law, you got different obligation if you decide to target places like civilian places, because media are considered as civilian, and media professionals are considered by civilian also by the Geneva Conventions. So they are protected. But if the Israeli forces decide to target, for example, media building hosting media places, should be like at least some like they should make clearly the distinction between civilian and combatants, so the principle of distinction. There should be also, there is a principle of proportionality, that the action should be proportionate to the objective that the Israeli army should want to obtain. And the last obligation is clearly this, in addition to the distinction and the proportionate, that they need to, the precaution, so they need to inform people inside the building that they're going to, in case of military action. But Reporters Without Borders repeat that media places and media professionals should not be targeted. They are really protected by the IHL and the UN resolution from 2006.
All right. Let's speak to journalists then working on both sides of this conflict. We'll start with Rami Almeghari, who's in Gaza. Rami, tell me about the conditions under which you are working right now in Gaza.
These conditions, first of all, thank you for hosting me, for talking to this program under a very tense situation in Gaza for the time being. The conditions underway in the Gaza Strip are unprecedented. The first difficult or the first hard conditions in Gaza for the past 8 years. This is according to me as a resident, first and foremost, and as a journalist, and according to many people who live here. Hundreds of people, hundreds of thousands of people live here in this part of the world. The conditions are very difficult, as I just mentioned. You know, I can give you sort of an example for that indicates how difficult the situation, how critical the situation is in this part of the world for the time being. About a few days ago, I wrote a story about my own activity as a reporter, as a correspondent, my own task and responsibilities to take and to take on my shoulders. I went right away. I left my home, left my children under the shelling, around intensive, frequent shelling by the Israeli airstrikes, and went right away. Maybe you hear now, maybe I'm not sure, you hear some sort of bombing just in the background. So I left these people, these dwellers who are my children and my wife, my sick wife actually, to go to take my responsibilities. While I was back from my reporting, I did a lot of interview in a hospital and other places. I went back. I was riding a cab, and the cab was really fast. And out of a sudden, about 70 meter or 100 meter away from us, on the other side of the street, an Israeli drone killed two on motorcycles and killing them instantly. And I saw them bleeding with my eyes, actually. That's what I saw. This was a very frightening situation for me as a journalist and a father taking responsibility for his children.
All right.
There is no place safe in Gaza for the time being, and you cannot judge or you cannot predict what's next in the upcoming few minutes or upcoming hour.
Okay, let's bring in Ben Hartman then, who's in Tel Aviv. Ben, you are the security correspondent for the Jerusalem Post. I just wonder if you have ever felt fear for your safety working as a journalist in Israel, as the kind of fear that Rami has just described.
Of course, every day throughout this entire escalation, every single time I go to the south, every single time I'm in the south, there's indiscriminate rocket fire across the entire, across all of southern Israel. Mortars, rockets, there's also snipers. None of this has guidance systems. None of these rockets or mortars are guided. They don't have names on them. I could easily be killed just like anybody else. It is absolutely unguided, and if I was killed by a Hamas rocket, I don't believe that Hamas would compensate my family. I don't believe that they would be condemned possibly by Qatar or other countries. That's just basically how it is. We're all, just like anybody else in the South, a journalist is just as vulnerable. Just like elderly people, the disabled, the handicapped, people who can't run, just like the Bedouin who was killed the other day in a tent encampment with no shelter. That's the thing with indiscriminate rocket fire, indiscriminate mortar fire, is that it can get anybody, anytime, anywhere. I'm here in Tel Aviv now. I don't know if any second now a rocket sirens are not going to go off and I'm going to have to run somewhere. So it's pretty much, that's the thing with indiscriminate fire on a civilian population. It can hit anybody at any time.
Ben,
now, is it to the same level as Gaza?
Yeah.
It's not.
I just wonder whether you talk about the indiscriminate fire coming out of Gaza, but surely, you know, I don't want to get into the politics of all of this at the moment, and I don't argue, you know, who's suffering more here. But surely you could argue with so many casualties, unintentional casualties in Gaza, that Israel's fire could also be described as indiscriminate. And I wonder whether the message of the number of casualties in Gaza is getting to the Israeli public. Are you under any restrictions when reporting on the events of this conflict as a journalist there in Israel?
There's absolutely no restrictions on reporting what happens in Gaza in terms of civilian casualties in Gaza, in terms of how many people were killed by the Israeli forces. I can write anything I want about that. Where the censor comes into play here in Israel, the military censor, is when it comes into security issues or when a soldier has died and the family has not been informed yet. Almost every day we know about soldiers who have died and we're not able to report it because they have to let their families know. So that's one way I'm not allowed to report something. I can't report the exact coordinates of where a rocket struck for security reasons. Sometimes the consideration of security can be a rather broad and kind of subjective sort of thing. However, when it comes to censorship of what I say about this operation or what I think of it or what's happening in Gaza, as long as it's not deemed by the military censor to put the lives of soldiers or civilians in Israel at risk, I can write anything I want to.
But Ben, why are Israeli journalists not allowed to work from Gaza?
Well, that's a restriction put in effect by Israel. I know personally, if I were to go into Gaza and I would be discovered as an Israeli citizen, as a Jew, I don't think it would end well for me, to put it lightly. I could very easily be taken captive by Hamas, killed, tortured, God knows what. This is a situation, a requirement put in effect by the Israeli authorities because they know that if an Israeli citizen falls into custody of the authorities in Gaza, they will then end up probably having to exchange prisoners, much like Gilad Shalit, and that's not a price that the Israeli public wants to pay again. And so they're trying to restrict any Israeli citizens from going there and being in that situation.
Rami Almeghari in Gaza.
It's not safe for me there, if that's not clear.
All right, Rami Almeghari in Gaza. We talked about the fear that you felt after witnessing a close hand an Israeli drone attack. Are you subject to any form of harassment, intimidation, or aggression from groups or individuals within Gaza?
I cannot say this absolutely. The situation is, I cannot say that I am being subject to any kind of harassment or aggression by any party, but you know, the aggression or the harassment comes abruptly when you are doing your reporting, your work. You might be subject to any kind of an harassment, indiscriminate fire, or something like this. I want to tell you, because we are talking about the fears that journalists might face under such very tense situation, very hostile environments in many parts of the world. We have very tense situation right here. I can't tell you about how this indiscriminate fire might be affecting me for the moment. Actually, this indiscriminate fire has ripped through my own hometown of Benghazi, okay, where I live in the central Gaza Strip. And this was very intensive Israeli tank shelling for the beginning of the strikes on the Benghazi refugee camp that was preceded by Israeli warnings on recording messages on phones of the people. I saw so many people fleeing into schools and some other places to seek safety and safe shelter. I myself was frightened that my house, which is located in Benghazi, to be struck by this indiscriminate Israeli shells. I am hearing, while I am really away from my home for the past 3 days, being forced out of my home to seek safety or safe shelter with my my sick wife, actually, and I hear that the shells are falling frequently on different houses, several houses in my neighborhood.
Okay.
This makes me under very big harassment, very big, actually, sort of harm that might expose me as a journalist. Other than this, I cannot say I am being faced I am facing a pressure by groups or individuals.
Rami, you are displaced currently, which is not a good situation for any journalist to be working in. I just want one final question. You say that you're not subject to any harassment or intimidation, but are you working under any restrictions? We heard perhaps Ben on occasions has to deal with the censor, but is anyone there in Gaza telling you what you can and can't say as a journalist?
Actually, this is a very good question that has been repeated for the past several years by journalists, during reporting, during articles or something like that. I feel that there is a kind of a self-censorship for the whole community, journalists and the Gaza. Everything is being under scrutiny. That is a clear scrutiny by the groups and the parties concerned here in the Gaza Strip. There was a sort of a ban on Gaza journalists for the past years not to work with Israeli media outlets, and that ban was imposed by the Hamas-led government.
Okay.
Also, if there is some kind of reporting by some kind of reporters from the ground in Gaza working with internationals or locals, and that report includes some sort of misinterpretation, of misinformation, this can be scrutinized and being questioned by the local authorities located in this part of the world.
Okay. Soazig, in Paris, what concerns does Reporters Without Borders have about the way in which Israel is currently treating journalists, not just in Gaza, but in Israel as a whole?
Generally speaking, that we noticed that compared, for example, that 2008, 2009, the Caslead operation, the Israeli army and the Israeli authority decided to allow foreign journalists so far to enter the Gaza Strip, which is a big difference, for example, from what happened in 2008, 2009. But still, now that it seems that according to the information that we received, because of the security threats after the Erez crossing, that the situation is really dangerous for foreign journalists to enter the Gaza Strip. So that's the security of foreign journalists and Palestinian journalists is highly sensitive, and we wonder for Reporters Without Borders if the Israeli army is deliberately targeting media offices. We know that yesterday, clearly, there was warning shots on Al Jazeera office yesterday, and we strongly condemn in a press release yesterday those warning shots, and as well as the declaration of the foreign minister, Israeli foreign minister, Avigdor Lieberman. And but regarding the other places, we know that journalists had been injured because of strike or raids from the Israeli army against media building in the Gaza Strip. Deliberately or not, this is the case. Media professional had been wounded by Israeli forces during this raid, and at least one media professional had been killed while doing this work, Khaled Hamed, and a driver from Media 24 was also killed while returning his office at the beginning of the military.
Okay. Ben Hartman, you heard about Rami's plight, the fact that he is currently displaced in Gaza. You heard about those shots being fired into our Al Jazeera bureau in Gaza. Are you able to feel any empathy with your colleagues working on the other side of the divide?
Certainly, I feel empathy for anybody, any civilian who's caught in the crossfire of an armed conflict, be they on my side or their side or any side. I don't have any. That's not a that's not even a question. I would like to say that I've also heard like there is actually a good deal of intimidation of journalists going on there, but But when it comes to whether or not I can feel empathy, I can certainly feel empathy. I can feel empathy for Palestinians in Gaza who are being killed, and also people here. What I think I've seen in the last few weeks of this operation, traveling in the south and across Israel, the people who suffer the most are the weakest. The people who are hurt the most are civilians. They are the old, the elderly, the poor, the disabled, people who don't have anywhere to run and don't know how. That's the same here and the same in Gaza. The people who are hurt are the weakest, and definitely I sympathize for them.
Ben, I just wonder, in such a polarizing conflict, if it's possible to objectively report on what's happening. Do journalists in Israel write according to what their audience would expect to read? Does the Israeli public get an objective or a skewed view of the conflict?
I guess it depends on what you mean by skewed. I've never felt any pressure whatsoever about how I should portray something. I write about what I see, what I hear, and what my impressions are. It may be skewed in the sense that, you know, Israelis have a universal draft. Almost every single Israeli family has children in the army. So when there's a military operation that's launched, it hits close to home in a way that it doesn't maybe in America or possibly in the Gulf, or I don't know, in other places. So in that sense, there's a certain level of sensitivity about writing about the army, about the military, that you don't have elsewhere. So it might skew it in that sense.
Ben,
but in terms of whether or not I've ever been intimidated by Israeli authorities to write things in a certain way or another, that has never happened, by no means whatsoever.
That was my next question was going to be if you or colleagues, do you know of colleagues who've been subjected to threats or intimidation because of what you're written or what you may write? Do journalists ever avoid writing about anything in particular aspects of a story for fear of provoking such a response?
What happens here is no matter what you write about anything involving Israel and Palestine, you're going to make people angry. Any article I write about the Israeli side, people on the Palestinian side are going to be angry, especially talkbackers, commenters online. If I write about Palestinian suffering, Israelis will criticize me. In terms of actual intimidation, this is not a dangerous place to be a reporter in the sense of press intimidation. What you have with the foreign press sometimes is certain levels of petty or worse harassment from Israeli security services. There was an incident involving an Al Jazeera reporter a couple years back. But in terms of actually being afraid to write something, but because I fear for my own personal safety, by no means has that ever crossed my mind. Where it could possibly come into effect, maybe if you write about organized crime and the mafia, you might want to watch what you say about people. But other than that, no. In terms of writing about politics or anything else, there's no reason to fear.
Rami Almeghari in Gaza, do you feel any obligation to cover the other side of the story, the Israeli perspective, or would you perhaps come under harassment, intimidation, or aggression if you did so?
Well, actually, this is a sort of the question is that what is going here in a part of the conflict that is ongoing in this part of the world is a conflict that is going on for the sake of peace, for both peoples on both ends of the Palestinian land, that for the Israelis and Palestinians. And I believe that reporting or showing up the stories or featuring the stories of the conflict from here as a journalist, I consider myself to be as an independent journalist. And I have been really working on this in that independency very firmly for many years. So I would have no problem if I can feature some stories, because I feature human interest stories. So and the purpose for all the media work, for all the political work, the media work in this part of the world is to come out with a real sort of a real peace for all peoples in this part of the world. So human beings are human beings wherever they are.
Rami, sorry to interrupt you, but we are out of time for this particular edition of Inside Story. Thank you to all of you. Soazig Dollet in Paris, Rami Almeghari in Gaza, and Ben Hartman in Tel Aviv. Do let us know your thoughts. You can leave your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story on Twitter. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finighan. Thanks for watching this edition of Inside Story. I'll see you again. Bye for now.